Hi, I'm Peter Gagan, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Mark Galeotti. Mark is an author and journalist who's written extensively about Russia, Vladimir Putin, and the workings of power in and around the Kremlin, as well as a lot more besides. His most recent book is the excellent Homo Criminalis, How Crime Organises the World. Mark, welcome to Democracy for Sale.
Oh, great to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
We're speaking just after the UK government has announced an inquiry into foreign interference in British politics. Based on what we already know, like how serious a problem do you think foreign interference is in the UK? And obviously, Russia is something we've been hearing a lot in this context.
I think the problem is that we're caught between two different models, which we could think of as the bespoke and the wholesale. At the moment, the focus is on the bespoke level. Individual politicians being given bungs, being given bribes in order to give a speech one way or make a statement that way. Which obviously, it's terrible, and I'm not in any way defending it. But on the whole, my sense is it's pretty small scale stuff. Some fairly fringe in this particular case, the Gill case, a pretty fringe politician being paid to make some statements about how the Ukrainian government is being nasty to a particular Ukrainian/Russian politician. It's hard to see how that really would move the needle in any substantive way. But nonetheless, again, it is clearly an example of corruption. And then, of course, there is the wholesale one, which is through the algorithms and the online distortion of the information space in which we operate. And this is, interestingly, something that the new incoming head of MI6, Blaise Metraweli, sort of raised in a speech the other day about the degree to which actually the tech barons are becoming powers in their own right, equivalent to nation states. And that's something that we talk a lot about, but it's so much harder to do anything about. So in some ways, I wonder if almost the focus on the bespoke stuff is just a bit of a distraction to make us feel better.
Yeah, this is the thing I was really quite striking, actually, I think, about this. It feels the remit is quite narrow. It feels like it's, as you say, on the back of this one case, whereas actually what we've seen, it doesn't go back, say, to the Brexit referendum. If you look at, say, the Russia report that came out in the back of that, actually online is where a lot of things are happening, both from foreign state perspective, but also, as you say, from tech barons as well.
Yeah, and I think, look, again, just to sort of talk about the specific case, the other thing that always struck me about the sort of personal influence things, I've looked a fair amount at the claims of influence carried out by Russian oligarchs and minigarchs in London, particularly in the pre-2022 days when, they were actually much more able to travel to and hobnob in London's sort of circles. But the thing that often strikes me is, insofar as one can suggest that they were trying to use influence, it wasn't about, this is why you must be nice to Putin. No, it was about, this is why I should be given planning permission to build a new underground swimming pool in my fancy residence. It was on very, very small scale personal stuff, or it was just vanity stuff, getting to play tennis with Boris Johnson or whatever else. Whereas, yes, if we go on to the online stuff, it can be done at scale and en masse in terms of distorting the information. But also what really worries me is something that, for example, we know that the Russians are beginning to test this out. And if the Russians are going there, then there will be other actors doing so, is using artificial intelligence, using AI, so that you can actually micro-target. So rather than just simply broadly trying to sort of identify categories, so you think, well, I don't know, Scots who have subscribed to a particular series of websites probably means they're in favour of independence, so let's push a certain amount of pro-independence propaganda that way, which we know the Russians did, although there's no evidence that it actually really had any major impact. Now they can really almost work on the level of an individual. This particular person, the AI will work out, well, they like Scottish nationalism, they like cats, so let's come up with propaganda that basically says the English want to kill your cats unless you vote for independence or something. A trivial example, and obviously the real one is much more complex. But the capacity of new technology to be able to actually distort the information space around us. So instead of just simply telling us you should vote for this, just simply ensuring that we are surrounded by information that nudges us in that direction, that makes us think that all right-thinking people would want to vote for this candidate or this party or this particular proposition in a referendum. That is incredibly sinister. And it's something that, as I say, I'm not convinced, although the terms of reference for this inquiry allow them to tiptoe into it. I'm not convinced they're going to have anything like the kind of mandate or resources to actually come up with anything substantive other than probably propose a new inquiry.
And it's really striking. But part of what I kind of feel as well is I remember looking at the 2016 election, Trump victory in America when I was writing my last book, when I was writing Democracy for Sale. And what was striking as well is that part of the goal isn't necessarily to push you towards specific political objective as well. It can be just to create a sense of tumult and chaos. So you actually had at one stage simultaneous protests that were effectively the Internet Research Agency was really, really involved in both pro and anti-Hillary Clinton happening side by side. And it was kind of creating this environment, which has actually been the information ecosystem going say back to the Balkans and the Balkan Wars. Like this is a long running, but in some ways the internet has supercharged the ability to create this sort of information ecosystem where trust just breaks down.
Yeah, and I think particularly if one looks at the Russians, and obviously I'm going to default onto them, though there are, it's like those at times of elections, and there are other candidates, there are other disruptors. But if one looks at the Russians, they tried and essentially failed to influence specifically to influence the outcomes of votes. They tried it in Germany, they tried it in France, they tried it in the United States, and they also tried it with the Brexit referendum. Now, sometimes the results went the way they wanted. They wanted Brexit, they wanted Trump. But when they then look at the actual degree to which their resources actually shifted the needle, it was irrelevant. But on the other hand, now, what we exactly get is instead a drive towards disruption. The point is, the Russians have no magic mind control powers. They can't make people think things that they don't believe. What they can do is, to use the terrorism parlance, radicalise. They can take people who have a sense and more or less tell them, wow, yes, you're absolutely right, and this is an existential moment for you, your country, your society, your race, or whatever. And this is why, rather than just simply grumbling at the kitchen table, you should be out there on the streets, and you should be protesting and doing something about it. And for example, those studies that have been done about the impact on the Brexit referendum, again, it didn't move anyone from pro or anti to the other side. But it did take some people who were mildly dissatisfied with the EU and make them feel that, yes, they needed to be out canvassing and putting up leaflets and such like. And yes, this capacity to actually play every side, particularly, look, Putin's Russia is essentially a post-ideological state. It kind of talks about traditional values, but it's actually nowhere near as kind of traditionalistic as that. And in any case, because there is no equivalent to the old Soviet Communist Party providing any kind of ideological straitjacket, as you say, they can support whoever is useful. So they can simultaneously support the National Rifle Association and Black Lives Matter. They can support sort of federalists and nationalists, anti-capitalist anarchist protesters and, right-wing traditionalists. Whoever is useful, because their view is precisely what they want to do is take the existing divisions and disputes that are inevitable within democracies, especially around election time when everyone is trying to basically sharpen these divides and use that to cut out constituencies for themselves. Anyway, what the Russians want to do is basically maximize those so that in effect we paralyze ourselves. We are so busy rowing amongst ourselves that there's no way we can form some kind of united front against anything else.
And I think what's quite striking, as someone who actually used to, out of interest, watch quite a bit of something like RT to see, and what was formerly Russia Today, to see the narratives they're pushing. And I remember a few years ago watching quite a lot of it in Germany, and they were really pushing the narratives that fed into the AfD. So this sense that Germany's been overcome by migrants. What's kind of striking now is we have actually homegrown media that are really pushing similar narratives. Like if you turn on GB News, actually the comment page of the Telegraph, like it feels like our media, like whether actually, it doesn't necessarily have to be as you say, as overt as here's money to do something. What in some ways you're doing is already getting into those fissures. And actually the more you expand those fissures, the more they will expand by themselves in some respects too.
Yeah, and look, to be perfectly honest, as a personal statement, I would take RT over GB News any day. But yes.
What do you mean by that? Yeah.
I mean, Because I suppose two reasons. One is that I find the kind of bilious message of GB News so hard to take, and at least with RT, you can think, well, yeah, but at least it's kind of it's a foreign influence operation rather than a genuinely felt thing. But also, actually, the thing about RT, and this is one of the reasons why I think it shouldn't have been banned. I mean, I think it actually was a very defensive move to do so. Better just simply to highlight the flaws and find them when they say something wrong than to ban and make them forbidden fruit, because it's not like people can't still watch RT. They can still find all sorts of ways you get your VPN and you watch it on YouTube or whatever else. But you've turned it into forbidden fruit. But no, but the other reason why I take RT is actually, I mean, RT was a strange beast. I mean, its whole mantra of question more, which did mean, on the one hand, you would have shows with really very, very deeply problematic messages. But also, actually, it did mean that they often provided a voice to people who actually are squeezed out of the mainstream. And we have a tendency to think of that as a code for, unpleasant ultra-nationalists or similar. But it wasn't necessarily that. And I think in that respect, one heard things on RT that sometimes it was actually worth hearing. One can disagree with them fundamentally and wholeheartedly, but nonetheless, again, I suppose if we're going back to the whole tech barons thing, I mean, the other element of that is who gets to be the gatekeeper, who gets to decide whose narratives ought to be propagated. I think having the sort of RTs of this world can help narratives come out there, and if nothing else, make people feel that they're being heard. There is nothing more corrosive and dangerous to democracy than people feeling that they are being excluded. Because then, instead of thinking, I have a chance to actually present my perspective in a democratic environment, they think it's all a sham, it's all a lie, we need to break the system.
And I guess kind of feeding in from that, like, what do you think? I'm really struck, having read the recent national security strategy from the US, which is quite a remarkable document. Whereas in the past,
Indeed,
Chinese communism, as the enemy for a long time, or communism in general, it is now explicitly Western liberal democracy, which is the problem. Like, how like, it's very, we've had a lot of, like, Trump is in the pocket of Putin and all the rest of it, but it feels to me that actually what we're seeing more is a kind of convergence of worldviews.
Yeah, I think that's the reason why Trump and Putin get on so well. But also, it's worth noting, I mean, I think Trump has never met an autocrat he doesn't get on well with. But I mean, I think the thing is exactly, they have a view of the world, which, first of all, is intrinsically dog-eat-dog. That alliances or anything like that, they are just simply temporary, transitional, and they are things that are there just for your interest. That the world is essentially shaped by a handful of great powers, and other countries, the only question is really who gives them the orders. And a world in which essentially great men, powerful, charismatic figures, actually can bend the arc of history in their way. And I think, therefore, Trump, often he's motivated by, he's a wannabe strongman. He wants to be allowed into the strongman club. But on the other hand, I mean, certainly if one looks at the Russian press and talks to Russian experts, they have no illusions that Trump is in their pocket. And as far as they're concerned, Trump's interests are Trump's. And at present, there are areas of convergence, because particularly from Trump's point of view, firstly, he wants the Ukraine war ended. He doesn't care about Ukraine. He wants this embarrassing war that, after all, he'd said he could settle in 24 hours off his desk. And also, he sees the European Union as an impediment to American commercial hegemony. So, he's very happy to see the European Union sort of broken. Putin's fine with that. But that doesn't mean to say it was either A, necessarily Putin's priority, and B, that Putin thinks that Trump's doing it for his gain. So yes, I mean, I think it's really about a kind of a convergence of interests and worldviews. And one last point I'd make is that, as you said, rather extraordinary national security strategy is not a national security strategy. It's a Trump security strategy. And therefore, if nothing else, in some ways, I don't think it changed anything. Its significance was it said the quiet part out loud. But in some ways also, it's interesting because it actually represents a sometimes rather clumsy attempt to mesh two specific perspectives. That there is this ideological MAGA notion of a struggle against wokeism, of which obviously Europe is regarded as the prime example. Hence the need to encourage all these parties to sort of stop the civilizational erasure of Europe. But also, look, I think Trump himself really, he sees himself as the chief executive officer of USA Incorporated. Very much has essentially a businessman's approach. So it's not about representing a people. It's not about articulating values. It's about bringing profit to your company. And in that respect, in some ways, I think he sees other countries and blocs as just simply rival companies with whom you compete. But on the other hand, you may well find reasons to actually make some kind of business alliance in the pursuit of mutual profit. And it doesn't matter if we're talking about, China or Chad or Chile. It doesn't matter if we're talking about Brazil or Bulgaria. What the actual country is, whether it's a democracy or a dictatorship, well, that's irrelevant. It's like saying, do you really care if it's a, PLC or a privately held company or whatever else? They're all companies, they're all business rivals, and that's how you look at the world.
One thing that did strike me from let's call it the Trump security strategy, one thing that struck me from that was the explicit, in some ways I agree, it said it was a quiet part out loud, and in many ways it echoed what J.D. Vance had said in Munich back in February. But what was really striking was this commitment to, I think the language is about supporting patriotic parties in Europe, which is effectively far-right parties. You're talking about the Rassemblement National in France, you're talking about the AfD in Germany, you're talking about Reform here in the UK. And that does seem to mirror Russia's strategy. And Russia has helped these various parties. And as you say, maybe not in election-defining ways, but sometimes, we've seen stories, say, from Italy and Lega Nord and with Russian money. Marine Le Pen was very dependent, Front National were very dependent for a long time on Russian money as well. There is a sense in which there's an overlap when it comes to a form of electoral interference. I'm just wondering, what do you think about that? And what do you think that might look like?
Well, I think, again, it's an almost accidental convergence in that, essentially for their own reasons, both, I wouldn't say the United States, but I'll say the Trump White House and the Putin Kremlin both want to see Europe in particular divided, and they also want to see a certain vision of Europe. From the Russians' point of view, I don't think Putin really cares about what the gay marriage laws in the Netherlands are. But on the other hand, it is very useful for him, given that the Russian people regard themselves essentially as Europeans. They don't see themselves as Eurasian or anything like that. They see themselves as Europeans, but the good Europeans, the Europeans who haven't become susceptible to the virus of wokeism and the like. In that respect, actually being able to point to the fact that you have allies in Europe shores up Putin's position at home. It shows, isolated, not so much actually, because of that. The healthy forces in Europe are coming back to us. Whereas from Trump's perspective, I think it is both a combination of just a sort of visceral dislike of certain kinds of values with, as I say, a desire to actually weaken and shatter, if need be, the European Union. So, I think that there is convergence, but it comes from different sources. And from the Russians' point of view, I think that they had no problems with, for example, if there were disruptive parties of the left to support, in a way that the Trump White House is not going to pivot. They're not going to say, that Jeremy Corbyn, he's handy, let's sort of try and magnify his voice, in a way that actually, one could imagine certain Russians saying, this is a useful particular kind of narrative to amplify.
Just before I want to talk a bit more about your book, but just quickly, while I have you, where do you see things in regard to Ukraine? We're hearing a lot of stuff in the last few weeks about this Russian-backed peace deal. Let's see what Witkoff seems to be very much in favor of. Do you think you're going to spend this Christmas writing about what's happening in Ukraine, or where do you think things are going?
I think I'm pretty much cursed to be writing about Ukraine. Whatever happens, one way or the other, it'll just be a question of whether I'm writing why the peace talks failed or why they succeeded. Look, I would love to be more optimistic. I think it's interesting that we've had this current line that says that 90% of the issues have been resolved. And I think that's probably true. Yes, what emerged would, of course, be an ugly peace, because Russia is... Well, I'm not sure if one can say Russia is winning, but I tend to think of it more as both sides are losing, but the Ukrainians are losing faster than the Russians. And there is, I think, a increasing consensus that time is not necessarily on the Ukrainian side. Yes, the Russians are losing manpower at a terrible rate. Yes, the Russian economy is sliding into recession and so forth. But a sense that in 6 months or 12 months' time, it's not as if Kyiv will be in a stronger position to be able to sort of make a case. That said, there are, in that 10% of issues that have been unaddressed, I think there are a couple of ones which I don't think can be addressed at the moment. One of them is security guarantees, which is a moment, as we speak, very much the Europeans are pushing this idea of a European multinational force on the ground. Now, if one looks at Putin's speeches from before he invaded, it was never the prospect of Ukraine inside NATO that he was talking about. It was about the prospect of NATO forces inside Ukraine. And he would just see this as just, a NATO battle group by another name. So I think this is not something he's willing to accept, and ultimately he can decide whether to accept a peace deal or not. The second one is Putin's demand for the remaining unconquered fifth or so of Donetsk region. Now, this is one of the reasons why I was very keen on there being negotiations, because it's only when you get into negotiations that you really test the rhetoric. And it was unclear beforehand whether this really was one of Putin's irreducible demands, or whether it was just a big bargaining chip that at some point he would say, well, okay, but in return, what are you going to give me? It's looking at the moment, it might be that he really is playing chicken, and at the 11th hour and 59th minute, he'll change his view. But certainly in the moment, it really is looking as if Putin is absolutely still going to demand this territory which, let's be honest, is steeped in the blood of Ukrainian defenders. And I don't think it's something that Volodymyr Zelensky could give, even if he was willing to do so. I was talking to a contact of mine in Kyiv, who is close to the more nationalistic, frankly, more unpleasantly nationalistic wing of Ukrainian politics, who said that, look, if Zelensky decided that, he would not survive this. And I asked him, do you mean politically? And his response was, not necessarily. Which I think gives you a sense of the kind of... Now, again, there may be an element of bluster and so forth there, but I think it gives a sense of just how fiercely held this view is. And so I think that, in some ways, all the easier stuff has been sorted out. But that remaining 10%, I'm not convinced that any kind of shuttle negotiations at the moment are going to resolve it. Putin is too adamant. He's too determined. Look, he feels he's winning the war anyway. I think as far as he's concerned, it's win-win. If he gets the peace deal that he wants, fine. But on the other hand, if he has to fight for another year or longer to get what he wants, fine too. And unfortunately, that means he's probably not going to compromise.
It's very interesting, Mark. Just a slight gear change. I just want to talk to you a little bit about your recent book as well, on Homo Criminalis, which I found really fascinating. I read it for the Times History Supplement recently. And I guess in some ways it does chime with a lot of what we've been talking about, actually, because what you're talking about is the rise of state power is one of the things I thought was fascinating from this. The book is kind of like, as it suggests, it's kind of a story of crime from olden times to now. You're telling the whole kind of story. But what I found really interesting was how this has been tied up with the rise of state power. And in some ways, what we're seeing more and more is that complete interconnection between state power, whether it's scam centers in Cambodia and the role of the political elites in Cambodia and Thailand were making them happen, or the Kremlin, or even our own dirty money problem here in the UK.
Yeah, and I think it's one of the well springs of the book, apart from just my own unhealthy fascination with these nasty people. Maybe it's obviously because the surname Galeotti, that actually in Italian it means galley slaves, but it also nowadays means convicts. So maybe there was an element of determinism there. But was precisely this cozy notion we have is that there is something called the underworld, which happens somewhere else. Maybe it's socially distinct from us. It's a bunch of tattooed guys called Nobby sitting in a pub somewhere planning their next heist. Or maybe it's geographically distant. It's drug gangs in Latin America or whatever else. But anyway, it's cozily far away when in fact actually our societies are entirely underpinned and threaded through by criminality. And in some ways we shouldn't be surprised because, although it's a little bit glibbed, but nonetheless, when one looks at state building, process of state building is fairly indistinguishable from gang building. And although we can talk about that as a sort of a primordial process way back in sort of distant times when force allowed you to create power, which you then in due course legitimated with all the suitable myths. I deserved to have this power because I drew a sword from the stone, or God said that I was going to be the monarch, or whatever else. But if one looks at the modern world, when states collapse, when we have vacuums of power, actually, how do new proto-states form? If you look at Afghanistan, yes, the Taliban have got control in Kabul, but de facto power over much of the country is still in the hands of local tribal warlords, who, in due course, some of them will get destroyed, some of them will eat each other, and some of them may well actually become essentially state structures. If you look at Somalia, a place like Puntland, which has basically toyed with being both a pirate state and an anti-pirate provider. But again, it just emerged because vacuums get filled in due course. And essentially what you need to fill that vacuum, you start off with the capacity to deploy violence. And the better you are at it, the more likely you are to be a state builder.
Earlier this month, I went to the launch of the UK's anti-corruption strategy. It's new strategy. David Lammy was talking it through, and there was various people there, and like the things that Britain's going to do to tackle its dirty money problem. How important is Britain in some of the things that you've been writing about, this like kind of facilitation of crime?
Oh, look, Britain in the City of London is, of course, sort of central to the global criminal economic ecosystem. But that's the whole point. It is a system. If you look at the dirty money, it's the same way as, like, look, we have these sort of classic Transparency International and similar surveys of corruption, which tend to point to this nice north-south divide, broadly speaking, where, on the whole, it's countries in the south, they're corrupt and they're bad. Countries in the north, well, we're great. But if you look at where that money ends up, actually, corruption is to a large extent a process in which money from the south is siphoned off and ends up in Swiss banks, or indeed in banks in London or Frankfurt or Dubai or New York. And likewise, if you look at the laundering of dirty money from, say, drug gangs, you start off, sure, by trying to find ways in which you can smurf it into banks in more questionable jurisdictions, but you don't want to keep them there. You then want to move them, and you bounce them round jurisdictions, slowly working your way up the chain of legitimacy until finally you can get it into one of the sort of the gold star institutions like City of London, but also, as I said, others. At which point, well, remember, the purpose of laundering money is not about proving that it's legitimate. It's about making it impossible to prove that it's illegitimate. So even if people have concerns, it's so sort of the origins of this money is so distant. So yes, of course, a lot of it then ends up cohering in a place like London. But the only reason it's got there is because it has bounced through Israel and Cyprus, and then even more questionable jurisdictions and such like. So yes, on the one hand, we have to be aware of London's role as the sort of the place that gives that final little dry cleaning to what is already moderately clean money. But on the other hand, there is sometimes a little bit of a sort of self-indulgent self-flagellation that suggests it somehow is a British vice. Yes, I mean, on the one level, a level of sanctimonious pragmatism is a very British characteristic. But nonetheless, we have to realize that it only works because everybody participates. It wouldn't get to... If you turn up to London with a suitcase full of cocaine-smeared $100 bills, they're going to call the police. It's only because of a whole system that has eventually allowed that to turn into what seems to be the profit from some Guernsey-headquartered company that allows it to move into the City of London as is.
Just one last question, I think, Mark, which is, it comes out in your book a bit, but it's something I've become very interested in recently, which is cryptocurrency. Mm-hmm. And the extent to which you can use things like stable coins, like Tether and others, Ethereum, you can buy, they're pegged to the US dollar. Is that going to change a lot of the things that you're talking about in terms of, like, it does seem to has the potential, at least, and we've seen instances where it has done, to kind of cut out a lot of these middlemen and take you straight from your illicit trade kind of straight into something that's backed against the dollar, where you can take money out of a machine in some of the dodgiest parts of the world.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I will start by making the admission, which is I don't know. Because in some ways, you talk to some people, and for them, cryptocurrency is the future of finance. It's in a post-state era. It's the natural evolution of globalization. We've globalized everything else. Now currency can be globalized too. And then there are others who basically say it's a bubble, and it will burst at some point sooner rather than later. And we'll all realize how stupid it all was. It'll take people who know a lot more and are a lot smarter than me to be able to arbitrate that particular route. But so long as cryptocurrencies exist, and particularly, again, as you said, the sort of stable coins, which are much less susceptible to sort of weird, dramatic, and sometimes engineered variations in value, it really highlights the degree to which actually law is still essentially a concept that is bounded by the nation state, and yet commerce, transport, information, all of these things flow almost seamlessly across those borders. And unless you're going to basically North Koreanize yourself, and I don't think anyone's really keen on that, not least very few North Koreans are very keen on that, you basically are stuck with that. And we don't have an answer beyond some kind of glorious notion of a sort of a world government. So this whole challenge that is exemplified by cryptocurrency, I think, is the whole challenge of global governance.
And in some ways, actually, I feel like we've come full circle. Actually, we started off talking about the role of tech and outside interference in politics and challenges with trying to deal with that. I think in some ways we're seeing the far side of that when it comes to money. And money and politics, as we know, are very often co-joined as well. Mark, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been really fascinating to chat to you. I've really enjoyed it. Homo Criminalis is excellent. It's very good. This is a review copy, but there's print copies available in shops, etc., etc. But thank you very much for coming on.
Oh, my pleasure. And not just for the plug of my book, but also, again, I've enjoyed this conversation a lot.